Switzerland, land of neutrality, delicious chocolate. And
Hmm.
come January 1st, 2025, a ban on burqas in public. You
Wow.
might be thinking, hold on, Switzerland, really? It seems like an unexpected move for a country known for tolerance.
It definitely challenges some assumptions, doesn't it? And this isn't Switzerland's first experience with this type of legislation. Think back to 2009,
Oh, yeah.
when the construction of new minarets was banned. Interestingly, it's the same group behind both initiatives.
Hmm.
So there's a historical pattern here suggesting a deeper societal trend worth exploring.
It's fascinating how a seemingly simple news story can unravel so many layers of complexity. So to help us understand the context, we'll be diving into a couple of sources. You shared a Reuters article outlining the details of the upcoming ban,
Okay.
and an Instagram post capturing a spectrum of public reactions.
Precisely, we're aiming to go beyond just the headlines. We'll analyze the ban's rationale,
Yeah.
examine the arguments for and against it,
Okay.
and consider the potential impact on Swiss society and beyond.
Okay, let's unpack this ban. The Reuters article lays out the specifics. It's set to come into effect on January 1st, 2025, with fines of 1,000 Swiss francs, a little over $1,000 for those who violate it.
What I find interesting is the article's neutral tone.
Mm.
It sticks to a factual presentation, avoiding any overt opinions or biases.
Mm-hmm.
This is crucial when tackling potentially sensitive subjects like this. It allows you, the listener, to form your own conclusions based on the information presented.
And as we move from objective reporting to the court of public opinion, the attached Instagram post paints quite a vivid picture. You have some commenters expressing outright support with remarks like, good move, and
Yeah.
the world is healing. Then there are those voicing their opposition. The whole world is against one religion, and how is the burqa harming anyone?
This range of reactions highlights the complexity of the issue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It touches upon long-standing debates surrounding religious freedom, cultural identity, and security concerns. It's a microcosm of the broader global conversation.
There's one comment in particular that caught my eye. These are the girls behind the Burqa ban. Their next generations will live dignified lives in a free world.
That's a loaded statement, and it gets to the
Mhm.
core of what we're discussing, the concept of freedom and its varying interpretations.
Because for some, the burqa might symbolize oppression, while for others, it represents a personal choice, an expression of faith, or even liberation. So whose freedom are we prioritizing, and at what cost?
It forces us to confront the complexities of balancing individual liberties with societal values. How do we as a society navigate the tension between personal choices and collective norms, especially when those norms are perceived as threatened?
And how does a country known for its neutrality and tolerance like Switzerland reconcile this ban with its own identity? This is where things get really interesting.
Indeed, this isn't simply about a piece of clothing. It's a much deeper dive into cultural diversity, individual rights, and the very definition of freedom in a globalized world. And to fully grasp the nuances, we need to analyze the motivations behind this legislation.
Let's go back to the world is healing comment. I'm curious about the underlying sentiment. What does healing imply in this context? It seems to suggest a sense of societal illness or a problem that the ban is addressing.
You've hit on a key point. If we unpack that comment further, it seems to suggest that the presence of the burqa was somehow detrimental to Swiss society. It taps into a broader sentiment, perhaps, of cultural anxiety, a feeling that Switzerland's identity is being diluted or threatened.
So we're not just looking at a neutral policy decision. We're seeing the expression of a specific worldview, a set of values that perceive the burqa as disruptive or even harmful.
And that raises an important question. Is this about genuine security concerns, or is it about a desire to preserve a particular cultural aesthetic, a vision of Swissness that excludes certain expressions of faith or identity?
This is where understanding the legal and societal implications of the ban becomes crucial.
Absolutely. To fully grasp the potential consequences, we need to go beyond the surface. What's the legal basis for the ban? Are there any historical precedents or parallels in other countries?
And what impact could this have on Swiss Muslim communities? Could this lead to further marginalization or social division?
These are crucial questions, and to answer them, we need to delve deeper into the historical context, starting with the 2009 minaret ban you mentioned earlier.
This isn't the first time Switzerland has grappled with these issues. Remember the 2009 minaret ban? That's the same group behind this initiative.
And to understand their motivations, we need to unpack the context of that earlier ban. It was, remember, approved by a referendum, a direct vote by the Swiss people. This reflects a particular segment of Swiss society's view, even if it sparked a lot of debate and accusations of Islamophobia.
It's almost like history is repeating itself, but with a different article of clothing at the center of the controversy.
And perhaps amplified in the age of social media, where opinions both informed and uninformed can spread like wildfire.
Speaking of social media, let's go back to those Instagram comments for a moment.
Of course. It's worth exploring what they reveal about the anxieties and motivations behind this ban. And to do that, we need to move beyond simply listing the comments and delve into the underlying themes and sentiments.
You're right. Instead of getting bogged down in individual comments, let's try to identify the broader narratives they represent. Are there any recurring patterns or arguments?
That's an excellent point. Let's group those comments thematically and analyze what they tell us about the Swiss public's perception of the Burqa Islam and perhaps even Swiss identity itself.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Remember that Instagram comment, the one that sparked our discussion on freedom? The one that said, "These are the girls behind the Burqa ban. Their next generations will live dignified lives in a free world." What struck you about that statement?
It's the assumption, isn't it? The assumption that the burqa is inherently undignified, that it somehow prevents women from living freely. It paints a very specific picture of the women who wear it, ignoring the possibility that for some, the burqa might actually represent a form of freedom or empowerment.
Exactly. It imposes a singular narrative, a universal experience on a diverse group of women. It negates their individual agency, their personal reasons for choosing to wear the burqa.
And it raises a really important question. What does freedom actually mean? It's a word we throw around a lot, but it can have vastly different interpretations depending on your perspective and lived experience.
You're absolutely right. Think about it. For one person, freedom might mean the freedom to express their faith openly, even if that means wearing a burqa. For another, it might be the freedom from having to conform to societal expectations or religious norms.
So how do we reconcile those competing visions of freedom in a democratic society like Switzerland's, especially when the majority, at least according to the referendum on the minaret ban, seems to favor one interpretation over the other?
This raises the question of how we balance individual liberties with societal values, especially when those values come into conflict. Switzerland, with its tradition of direct democracy, places a lot of emphasis on the will of the majority. But does that mean the rights of the minority can be disregarded?
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? On one hand, you want to uphold democratic principles and respect the outcome of a popular vote. On the other hand, you have to protect the fundamental rights of all citizens, even those who hold minority views.
Exactly. And that's where concepts like human rights and individual liberties come into play. These are universal principles that transcend cultural differences and societal norms. They safeguard the rights of every individual, regardless of their beliefs or practices.
So how do we find that balance? How do we create a society that's both democratic and respectful of individual rights, even when those rights might clash with the majority's views?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. It requires constant dialogue, open and honest conversations about our values, our fears, and our aspirations for the kind of society we want to live in. It demands a willingness to listen to and empathize with perspectives that differ from our own, even when they make us uncomfortable.
That's easier said than done, especially in the age of social media where it's so easy to retreat into echo chambers and surround ourselves with people who already agree with us. It's hard to have nuanced conversations when you're constantly bombarded with polarized opinions and inflammatory rhetoric.
You're right. Take those Instagram comments, for example. We see comments like, "good move," and "the world is healing," which offer support without really engaging with the complexity of the issue. Then you have comments like, "the whole world is against one religion," which suggest a sense of victimhood and fuel a narrative of us versus them.
And then you have the more provocative comments, the ones designed to stir up controversy and antagonize, like, "you can be naked but can't be covered." It's almost like they're trying to derail any attempt at meaningful dialogue.
It's classic polarization. Instead of engaging in thoughtful debate, people resort to emotional appeals, inflammatory language, and oversimplifications. And that makes it incredibly difficult to bridge the divide and find common ground.
But isn't that dangerous? I mean, if we can't even talk about these issues without resorting to insults and generalizations, how can we ever hope to find solutions that work for everyone?
It is dangerous because it creates an environment where fear and mistrust flourish.
Yeah.
It prevents us from seeing each other as human beings with valid concerns and experiences. Instead, we see each other as enemies, threats to our way of life. And that's a recipe for conflict and division.
So how do we combat that fear? How do we create a space for productive dialogue, even when discussing emotionally charged issues like this ban?
In my view, it starts with education and empathy. It's
Yeah,
about understanding the historical context, the cultural nuances, the lived experiences of those affected by these policies. When we take the time to learn about each other, to see the world through each other's eyes, it becomes harder to demonize or stereotype.
and perhaps that leads to less of those knee-jerk reactions and more of a willingness to engage in good faith conversations. But this ban isn't just about cultural sensitivities or freedom of expression, is it? There's also the security aspect to consider.
Absolutely. Some argue that covering one's face in public, whether with a burqa or any other type of face covering, poses a security risk, making it harder to identify individuals and prevent potential threats. This is a concern many governments are grappling with, especially in the wake of terrorist attacks and heightened security measures.
It makes you think back to the aftermath of 9/11 when we saw a significant increase in scrutiny and suspicion directed toward Muslims, particularly those who wore traditional clothing.
That's a prime example of how security concerns, while valid, can be easily exploited to justify discriminatory practices and target specific groups based on their appearance or religious beliefs.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we ensure public safety without sacrificing fundamental liberties and targeting innocent individuals?
It requires a nuanced approach, one that acknowledges the complexities of the issue and avoids simplistic solutions. It demands that we consider the specific context and potential risks while also upholding principles of fairness, equality, and due process. And it requires a healthy dose of skepticism towards any policy that singles out a particular group based solely on their appearance or beliefs.
Because history has shown us time and again that when fear and prejudice dictate policy, it rarely ends well.
Precisely. Knee-jerk reactions and discriminatory policies only serve to further marginalize and alienate those who are already perceived as different. And that can lead to a cycle of mistrust, resentment, and ultimately more insecurity.
It seems like we've gone from a seemingly simple news story about a burqa ban to a much deeper exploration of freedom, security, cultural identity, and the very nature of democracy itself.
And we've only just scratched the surface. This conversation highlights the importance of engaging with these complex issues thoughtfully and respectfully, even when they challenge our assumptions and make us uncomfortable.
Because discomfort often signals that we're learning, that we're expanding our understanding of the world and challenging our own biases. And that's never a bad thing.
Indeed. So let's continue to push ourselves to learn, to listen, and to engage in these crucial conversations. Because the more we understand each other, the better equipped we'll be to build a world that is both just and inclusive.
Now, I remember one Instagram comment asked a very straightforward question. What's the specific reason for this? It's tempting to look for a clear-cut answer, a single motivating factor behind this ban. But as we've seen, the reality is much more nuanced.
You're right. Attributing the ban to a single reason would be a gross oversimplification. It's a convergence of factors, concerns about security anxieties, about cultural change and national identity, a desire to preserve a particular vision of Swissness, and perhaps even a degree of political opportunism.
So are you saying there's no one answer that satisfies that commenter's question?
It's not about finding a singular answer, but rather about understanding the interplay of these different forces. We have public safety concerns intertwined with cultural anxieties, all playing out against a backdrop of shifting global dynamics.
It sounds like this isn't just a black and white issue. It's more a tapestry of gray with multiple perspectives, motivations, and emotions interwoven into the fabric of this ban.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so challenging and so important to discuss. If we can't even begin to understand each other's concerns and perspectives, how can we ever hope to find solutions that address the complexity of the issue?
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've unpacked the ban's details, explored the range of reactions, delved into the historical context, and grappled with the intricate questions about freedom, security, and cultural identity.
It's a lot to process, for sure. But that's the power of these deep dives. They allow us to explore multifaceted issues from multiple angles, challenging our own assumptions along the way, and hopefully emerging with a more nuanced understanding of the world around us.
And that's what makes these conversations so valuable, even when they're difficult or uncomfortable. Because ultimately, it's through dialogue and understanding that we can bridge divides and strive for a more just and inclusive society.
Well said. And now let's shift our focus to another fascinating aspect of this ban. Remember those Instagram comments that expressed outright support? I think it's time we dig a little deeper into those.
Sounds like we're going even deeper. Let's do it. All right, you're right. Let's explore those comments that express support for the ban. We've got good move, world is healing, even be like Swiss. What's your take on the overall sentiment here?
You can almost sense a sigh of relief in these comments, like something that was out of balance is being set right. World is healing. That's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
It implies that the burqa was, in their view, a symptom of something wrong, something that needed fixing.
So it's not just agreement with the ban, it's a deeper feeling that this action is somehow improving Swiss society.
That's how it comes across. And it connects to a broader pattern we're seeing globally, a pushback against the rapid pace of globalization and cultural change. There's a nostalgia for what's perceived as a simpler, more homogeneous past.
So is the idea that Switzerland was losing its Swissness and this ban is a way to reclaim it?
That's a potent narrative, and it resonates with many people, not just in Switzerland. It feeds into the idea that traditional values are under threat and strong measures are needed to protect them.
But who defines those traditional values? Because some might argue that tolerance and inclusivity are core Swiss values, and this ban seems to contradict that.
You've hit on the core tension here, clashing values. And this isn't unique to Switzerland. Globally, we're seeing a struggle to balance individual liberty, freedom of expression, and religious tolerance with concerns about national identity, cultural cohesion, and security.
And the burqa, in this case, has become the symbol of that very clash, a lightning rod for all those complex anxieties.
Exactly. It's a highly visible, tangible representation of something many find unfamiliar, even unsettling. In times of uncertainty, symbols like this become powerful focal points for those anxieties.
So even if they aren't explicitly saying it, are you suggesting there's an undercurrent of fear towards Islam, a sense that it doesn't belong in the Swiss cultural landscape?
It's a difficult conversation to have, but necessary. Whether conscious or not, there's often a layer of Islamophobia fueling these kinds of policies. It's crucial to acknowledge that, to understand how fear can shape public discourse and political decisions.
And you're saying this isn't just about the burqa, but a broader fear of the other, anyone who seems different, who doesn't fit neatly into the dominant culture.
You've got it.
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes truly problematic, because it lays the groundwork for discrimination and prejudice against entire groups of people, not based on actions, but on their faith, ethnicity, or any perceived difference.
So how do we address that fear? How do we have honest conversations about these complex issues without resorting to stereotypes and further fueling those anxieties?
It's a challenge for sure. But I believe it starts with education, with exposure to different cultures and perspectives. It's about humanizing the other, recognizing our shared humanity. You start to see that we all have the same basic needs and desires regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs.
And maybe a bit of critical thinking wouldn't hurt either, right? Learning to discern fact from fiction, to question assumptions, to recognize when we're being manipulated by fear-mongering tactics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In today's world, with misinformation spreading so easily, it's more important than ever to be critical consumers of information, to approach these conversations with open minds and a willingness to challenge our own preconceived notions.
This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. We started with a news story about a burqa ban and ended up exploring some of the most pressing issues facing our world: fear, identity, tolerance, and the very meaning of freedom in an increasingly interconnected society.
And these aren't questions with easy answers, but wrestling with them, engaging in these challenging dialogues, is essential. It's through those conversations that we can begin to build bridges of understanding and create a more just and inclusive world.
You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the headlines, the controversies, the endless back and forth of opinions. But what often gets lost are the human stories, the individual experiences at the heart of these issues.
You're so right. And I think that's a crucial takeaway for our listeners. To look beyond the symbols and the rhetoric and see the human beings whose lives are directly affected by these complex issues.
Because ultimately it comes down to recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness. It's about finding ways to coexist peacefully and respectfully despite our differences.
And that, I believe, is the most challenging and the most rewarding endeavor of all.
Well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity, encouraged some critical thinking, and maybe even left you with a sense of hope.
Until next time, keep diving deep.